So the teacher in Ecclesiastes has many things to say. He's very sometimes frustrated with life and gives us wisdom about it. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 13 to 18, he says this, I also saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man, poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. But nobody remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are no longer heeded. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. One of the best stories in our culture about a poor but wise man having the wisdom to save his friends is in the movie Star Wars. Now, this poor wise man who I have in mind is actually less of a man and more of a creature. Yoda. Remember Yoda from the movie. And Yoda's appearance in the film makes him look like he's not worth paying any attention to, right? Like he's small and kind of decrepit looking. He seems poverty-stricken, wearing that burlap sack. And of course, he talks funny. And when Luke first meets Yoda in the movie, they play up all of those factors so that Luke becomes flabbergasted to discover that the Jedi Master he's looking for is this little creature. But of course, it's only by Yoda's help and wisdom that Luke can get the wisdom he needs in order to face his enemies and save his friends. Now, I can easily imagine Yoda saying something like the proverb in verse 17, except, of course, that you have to rearrange the words, right? So he'd say something like, words of the wise, quiet. More to be heeded, yes, than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Now, after this occurred to me that you could talk this like Yoda, I realized that like the entire book of Ecclesiastes, you could speak like Yoda speak, right? I mean, somebody could do this, and it would sort of make sense. A time for everything there is, that kind of thing. Or, not to the swift the race, or to the battle the strong, yes, but to all time and chance. The whole book you could do as Yoda speak. And I'm sure that's more than enough because it does weird things to your throat to talk like that. But the good guys in the battle of Star Wars, they win in the end, right? And everyone goes out of the movie theater happy and talking like Yoda, and it's great. But this passage in Ecclesiastes is actually less concerned with the battle itself and more concerned with what happens after the battle. That's the twist in this text, isn't it? That it's the afterword that makes such a big impression upon the teacher of Ecclesiastes. Because somehow in real life, unlike the movies, nobody remembers that poor wise man. Once the danger's over, they all forget him. That's the twist in the text. Now, this type of story about one man saving the city is all over the movies, right? I mean, it's like every action movie is based somehow on this plot that we hear in this story, that against all odds, there's this little city and this big king, and there's this huge siege works, and what are they going to do? And against all those odds, one man comes forward with a plan. He's got the right idea and the wisdom. It's like David and Goliath, right? And the smaller David beats the bigger Goliath because he's got the right idea. And so against the odds, the poor man, who's wise, saves the city. Now you'd think that the lesson of the story here would be, well, don't judge a person by the outward appearance, like with money. But it turns out that the lesson is that nobody learns that lesson. Instead, from this text, the lesson is something more like, people can look past the outward appearance during an emergency, but then once the emergency is over and the danger has passed, they fall right back into the rut of judging people by their outward appearance and things like money. And the text gives us a clue about this. It says, when he saves the city, it says he's a poor but wise man. But then later, when it says that nobody remembers him, he's just called poor. They all forget that he was wise. He's just a poor man then. And it's worth noting as we get into this text that this really isn't a story about a man who saved the city. Really, this is a story about human nature and how human nature works, and about the things that people value and make judgments about. And so here's lesson number 1 about human nature from the text. It's the most straightforward lesson in the text, is that our human nature tends to value money more than wisdom. That's the most straightforward message from this scripture passage. Human beings have a tendency in their sinful human nature to judge people based on their money more than on their wisdom. And this story made such a big impression on the teacher of Ecclesiastes because it's such an extreme case. Because here's this poor man who's so wise that the people in that city owed their lives to him. They would have been slaves of that other king. They would have been suffering in some other country. They would have been perhaps dead because of the other king conquering their city. But now, because of the wisdom of this poor but wise man, they were saved. They owed their lives to him, and yet once the danger was over, they went right back to treating him the way they did before, as if he was a poor man and not a wise man. Such is the power of money on our sinful human natures. So that's the most straightforward teaching in this text. Now, the next thing for us to figure out is why. Why does it work that way in our human nature? Another key word for us to figure this out is in verse 16, where it says that they despised him. This word despised. And to despise something or something or someone or something is to devalue that someone or that something. Because if you devalue it, then you can ignore it. It's to treat it like it doesn't have any value. And so you say, well, this is beneath me. Or that's how you feel. This is beneath me. This thing or this person. I can ignore them. This is entirely true at the beginning of the scene where Yoda meets Luke. Luke has crashed his spaceship into the swamp in The Empire Strikes Back, and he's got all his stuff out of the spaceship. He set up his little camp and his food, and then R2-D2's with him, and then Yoda shows up, and he's just kind of chatting with him in his silly little way, looking at his food and pestering R2-D2 and asking him, oh, you're looking for a Jedi Master. I can help you. And Luke, he barely gives him the time of day. He thinks Yoda is beneath him. He treats him like he doesn't have any value. He despises him. This poor man who he doesn't realize is also wise, whose wisdom he needs, but he does not yet realize that. He begins by despising him. Now, at the end of their time together in that movie, Luke's spaceship has sunk all the way into the swamp, and he can't get it out. He tries, but he can't. And then, of course, Yoda, using his powers of the Force and his great wisdom, lifts the spaceship out and puts it on dry land, and Luke is amazed. He can't believe that Yoda has done this. It totally changes his sense of respect towards him because Yoda saved him. It was that moment of being saved that made him realize just how much wisdom this little guy had. So likewise, in the little story here, the poor wise man only got the attention of the city when they were so desperate from the danger that they listened to him. At that point, they were willing to try anything, right? That's when they stopped despising him, although in this case only temporarily. And despising is something that is an attitude in the heart. The heart devalues and so can ignore the poor but wise man. Now, the opposite of that in the heart is to treasure or to feel like it's precious. And so if you treasure something, you value it, right? If you despise something, you devalue it. But in any case, the problem is in the heart. And so this is lesson 2 about human nature in the text. Lesson 2 is that our hearts despise the wrong things. That's why we value somebody for their outward appearance like money rather than for their inner wisdom. Because our hearts have a problem when we value the wrong things. Or to put it the opposite way, instead of saying we despise the wrong things, you could also say we treasure the wrong things. But it's a heart problem. And so we need a heart change of respect for people to give them the dignity of hearing their wisdom, rather than simply judging them for some outward thing like poverty. Just like Luke needed that heart change to believe that Yoda really had the wisdom he could trust. Now, every now and then, I get to talk to people who are homeless. They come and they ask for help. And there's a few people who I've talked with. We sit down and we chat for a while. And I talk to them, and I have sometimes been so impressed by the wisdom that people who are homeless have for their survival, and how often it is that they are applying Scripture as their wisdom for their survival, or making it from day to day. And I've sat in our courtyard here and talked for a half an hour with a man who actually reminds me of Yoda a little bit, not just by the way he looks, but like his scratchiness of voice. He's a very scratchy voice. But the thing that amazes me is that like almost every sentence he speaks is sprinkled with some kind of allusion to Scripture, this treasury of wisdom. This is how he's making it. I'm always impressed when I talk to that man because he has this heart with wisdom in it that is important for me to hear, that I might respect his dignity and listen to his wisdom and not just write the guy off as somebody who I can help but then ignore. More than once that's happened to me, and I'm grateful for it. It takes those kinds of experience to wrench your heart from one direction to another. And our city needs churches full of people whose hearts treasure others, whose ears listen and give them the dignity of their wisdom without despising them, as the text shows us this city did when they forgot the man after he'd saved them. Our city needs churches full of people who treasure others and listen to their wisdom and look past the outward appearance to something deeper in the heart. The teacher urges us to remember that the poor have a dignity that is worth listening to, that is worth hearing their wisdom. They're worthy of our respect. That's what the teacher urges us. But it's hard to remember. It's hard to have that posture of heart, and it's easy to forget. And this forgetting and remembering is at issue in this scripture passage, isn't it? This is part of the problem, this forgetting and remembering. But I'll tell you some things about remembering. If somebody gave me a $100 bill, I would remember where I put it. If my brother got a $1,000 bonus at work, the next time we got together, I would remember and I'd say, yeah, I think you're going to pay for lunch today. I would tell him that. If my cousin won that Powerball lottery from a couple of weeks ago, I would call him up with some excellent vacation suggestions. I would say, how about that trip to Tahiti? You just won hundreds of millions of dollars. We could afford this together, right? See, people have no trouble remembering where the money is. But the writer of Ecclesiastes in this passage is reminding us that the opposite is also true. That people have no trouble not remembering where the money isn't. And that those with no money can be easily ignored, even if in their heart there is a treasure of wisdom. So you think the lesson in the text is going to be, don't judge a person based on their money, but nobody learned that lesson. Instead, here's the lesson. This is lesson number 3 about human nature. That it's human nature to judge someone based on what they can do for me. That's a tendency of our sinful human heart, to say, what can he do for me? That's what the city did in Ecclesiastes when they listened to this guy when he could save them, when there was danger, right? They listened to his wisdom because there was something in it for them. They were saved from their enemies. Finally, they listened to the poor but wise man because there was something for them. What's in it for me? Salvation from our enemies. That's when they listened. Stopped despising him. But then once the danger was over, they devalued the man because there was no longer anything in it for them. What's in it for me now for this poor but wise man? Not much. Wisdom, but not money. And people have this amazing tendency to be drawn towards the money when we think about another person's value. Now, this becomes especially obvious in extreme cases, and that's what this text is in Ecclesiastes. It gets our attention because it's kind of an extreme case. These people's lives were saved. Like that Powerball lottery situation from a couple weeks ago, it's kind of an extreme situation too, and it teaches a similar lesson. I saw in the news after that, after somebody won the Powerball lottery, there was a news article entitled something like "Advice for the Winners." And the first piece of advice for the winners was to change your phone number so that nobody knew what it was, right? Because everybody and their brother calls up the winner if they know him because they all want a piece of the pie, right? People remember what your phone number is if you just won $500 million. People want to get close to the money. So Powerball is like an extreme case, much like this scripture passage. And it shows this evil tendency of our hearts to value people based on what can he do for me. But this also works not just in extreme instances, but in the subtle ways as well. And it turns on this word of remembering. Who do we remember? What do we remember? And so who do we notice in our life? Who do we talk to in our life? Whether on the sidewalk near our homes, or on the sidewalk in front of church, or in our conversations, in who we talk about or what we talk about. All those subtle kind of ways of conversation and attention and noticing and valuing and who we regard gets wrapped up in subtle ways in this word remembering in the text. Nobody remembered that poor man. So the solution, of course, is to remember. But how? In these subtle ways of life. And the challenge is to remember and notice and talk about and talk with others quite apart from their money. Let that not be the factor in our attention. Now, Jesus teaches about this very topic in Luke chapter 14. And Jesus says in that chapter, you better not judge people based on this outward appearance. He says you should not do that. And he says, here is how I will know if you've learned the lesson. Here is the proof in your action. And he gives the instruction. Jesus had been invited over to a man's house for lunch. This Pharisee, is a prominent person, had invited him over for lunch. And so he tells his host these bold words. He says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back and you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. And although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So here in Ecclesiastes, the writer there, he gives us the diagnosis. He says, here's what's wrong with the human heart and its tendencies and its what it remembers and what it despises and what it treasures. Here's what's wrong. Here's the diagnosis. And then Jesus, with his words in Luke chapter 14, gives us the prescription. He says, if you want to live in wisdom and not according to that human nature, here's how. By inviting those who can do nothing for you into your life, and to do so in significant ways. And that's the proof that we learned the lesson, is to invite those who can do nothing for us into our lives in significant ways. Because this is how the gospel works too. From Jesus, we've received a gift that we can never pay back. It's not like we're doing something for Jesus that he can't do for himself. What can we give Jesus that he has not already given to us? And so Jesus says, if you understand your own spiritual poverty, if you understand that you live in grace that has made you rich towards God, then you will turn right around and look at those who are in poverty and bless them from your riches. And you will do so expecting nothing in return, and that is how I will know if your heart changed. That is how I will know if you learned the lesson. And our city needs churches full of people who treat those who are poor with dignity. Because Jesus, who was poor, Jesus, who came to us in our spiritual poverty, treats us with dignity. Our city needs people in churches who will love others with an unconditional love. Because we are people in churches who, in our spiritual poverty, were loved by Jesus with an unconditional love. That's what Jesus would do, and so that's what we are instructed to do as an expression of gratitude for grace. See, Jesus would never treat a poor but wise man badly, right? Jesus would always treat him well. You know why? Because Jesus was he himself was a poor but wise man. Jesus is that man. He is that poor but wise man who saved more than just a city. Jesus saved the whole world. So he would never treat a poor but wise man badly because he is that man. But then we must ask, how do we treat Jesus? This is the challenge. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. And so our attitude towards the poor and how we treat them, whether with dignity or with unconditional love, says a lot about our attitude towards Jesus, because Jesus was that poor but wise man. And so often people say, oh, Jesus, he's a good man. He's so wise. And then they turn around and they don't do anything he says. So often people say, I'm so thankful that Jesus saved me. But like the people in this little story in Ecclesiastes, they go right out and they ignore what Jesus says. And that is not the kind of people we should be, right? Instead, be people who say, Jesus saved me and I will live according to his words. Jesus gave me dignity and respect and love, and so I will turn with that same attitude towards others and not base it at all on outward appearance. And to invite people into my life in significant ways, no matter what they can do for me, because that is exactly what Jesus did for me. He invited me into his life, even though I can do nothing for him. And this is the challenge that hits in the heart, especially this one about who I invite into my life. Hit me this week. And there are ways, especially through organizations we partner with, where we can be a significant part of somebody else's life. We heard about that a little bit last week at the end of the video that I showed. Partnerships with organizations like Kingdom Causes can link you with a person, like Jesus talks about in Luke 14, that we may invite into our lives those who need to receive dignity, who have wisdom we should learn from, and who we can treat with unconditional love. Because our city needs churches that know this diagnosis from Ecclesiastes, but then also turn and live the prescription of Jesus' wisdom. Our city needs churches that are havens of salvation for the poor and for all, with Jesus as the wise man, as the source and the center. Jesus, the wise but poor man, saved the city, and we are a community like that city who are saved. This is a refuge. This is a fortress. This is a community of people who love one another because we've been transformed by Jesus' love. This is a place where people should experience that dignity and love. If this church can be a refuge like that city was, saved by the poor wise man, we are saved by Jesus, the poor wise man. Our city needs places like that, and our city needs churches that show the world how God is putting his world back together again. Putting his world back together through the love of his Son, expressed through the love of his people. Let's be that kind of church for our city.